Welcome back to the show, Congresswoman. The vote on the bipartisan infrastructure framework didn't happen on Thursday because your side, the progressives, stood firm. We're about to start a new week of negotiations. So, question, do you believe both these bills will still pass, or are we at risk of losing both of them? And would that be a price you're willing to?
Well, I do believe that both bills are going to pass. And I think that both bills, a big reason both bills are going to pass is because the American people supported an enormous caucus of 95 House progressives to defend these kinds of investments. Now, what I will say is that passing this so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill alone could and potentially will have net negative effects on climate. And on top of everything else, on top of the potential risk of not securing these generational and once-in-a-lifetime investments, the risk of doing harm to our climate right now is something that we cannot afford.
Yes, very well put. Congressman, I've been quite clear about the fact that we in the media have failed to accurately report on this bill as a $3.5 trillion package over 10 years. But your party has failed on the messaging too, hasn't it? Why don't Democrats refer to this as a $350 billion a year spending bill, just as they refer to our bloated defense budget as $700 billion a year and not $7 trillion over 10?
I wish we did. You know, I think that there's two factors for that. I think on one hand, you have very conservative Democrats and special interests that want to make this number sound very big and scary to more conservative and moderate voters. And on the other hand, you also have individuals who want to say that this is a big spending to tout, how unprecedented it is and how exciting it is. But the fact of the matter is that what we're discussing right now, as you say, is $350 billion. And when you look down on, for example, some of these conservatives that are trying to bring it down to the area of $1 trillion, or rather $1 trillion, that's $100 billion a year. That's the operating budget for New York City. And so imagine taking the yearly operating budget for New York City and trying to spread that all across the United States and act as though that is going to meaningfully change our lives. It's not. And that's why we have to make sure that we defend these investments.
So one of the very conservative members of your caucus, you referenced conservative Democrats, New Jersey House Democrat Josh Gottheimer, he says you're part of a small, far-left faction that, quote, blocked the president's agenda. And yet the president seems to be siding with you guys who didn't endorse him in the primaries over Gottheimer and co. who did, which is kind of amusing to me. What is your response to Congressman Gottheimer?
Well, I do math. And 95, which is the number of House Democrats or House progressives, is larger than 9, which is the number of Democrats who signed on to a letter threatening to sink the entire reconciliation bill back in August, demanding this vote this week for an arbitrary reason. Even the president wasn't demanding a vote this week. And so, I would wish that some of our folks were coming to the table the way that we are, but, also tensions get high in legislating and negotiating. It's a natural part of the process, and I wish him well.
Another conservative Democrat who won't come to the table very explicitly, Senator Sinema of Arizona, is also out with a statement attacking your side for betraying the American people, engaging in stunts, she says. Arizona Democrats are upset with her, threatening her with a vote of no confidence. As someone who famously came to office having primaried an out-of-touch conservative Democrat from the left, should Sinema now be worried about a primary challenge come 2024? Do you think that needs to be talked about more as a way of reminding her that the pressure is on in an increasingly bluish state, Arizona.
Well, I think ultimately that is always up to the folks right there in the state of Arizona. Are they happy with their leadership? Their most recent senator that they had just elected is more progressive, fights very hard for working families. But that is ultimately up to the people of Arizona. It is a state that is increasingly Latino and Latina. It is a state where indigenous people really just showed up and organized in incredible, remarkable ways for the presidential election. It is a place where working class populist politics is really taking off. And I think that, if you're home in Arizona, it's a question that you may want.
We've talked Gottheimer and Sinema. Let's talk Manchin, the third part of that puzzle. He's talked down to you in the past as a, quote, young lady on the left, and who literally talked down to a bunch of his constituents from his luxury houseboat in D.C. this past week. That was a symbol for us there, that image. As much as he likes to troll us, though, he's kind of right, isn't he, Congresswoman, when he says Democrats are in this boat because your party didn't elect enough people to Congress in general last November, and especially people with your kind of views. Progressives didn't win enough elections. That's fair, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the opposite is fair as well, right? In that you have the frustrations, perhaps on the left, that you have conservatives in the Senate that are blocking things like universal pre-K or free community college or expanding Medicare. But the same very much applies to these conservatives in the Senate. They are sending off, these very angry statements, but they could have elected more conservatives to the House of Representatives. But right now we have a caucus of 95 people who are holding strong because, frankly, the House of Representatives, it is not the undemocratic or as undemocratic of a body as the United States Senate is.
Yes.
And so as a result, it tends, and because our elections are every 2 years, it reflects the present moment of this country a little bit more quickly, I would say, and responsively.
They could have elected a non-left Democrat to the White House. Oh, wait, they did. And he's not on their side. One last quick question before we take a break on this part of the interview. We're going to talk to you after the break as well. One last quick question on this. I hate asking this because I hate this abstract numbers debate. I know you do too. But people are wondering, would you accept less than 3.5 trillion? We're hearing a number like 2 trillion or 2.1 trillion. Is that in the realm of possibility for Alexandria Ocasio?
Well, getting down to the low twos, that is something that's I think going to be quite difficult. But when it comes to this question of 3.5, there is this matter where we do have these two holdouts in the Senate. This is a conversation for us to have. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean cutting back the scale of these investments. It could mean where we say, okay, perhaps we do a 5-year infrastructure plan instead of a 10-year infrastructure plan. And that's where I think it's important to contextualize this number, because $3 trillion over 10 years is less per year than if we go $3 trillion over 5. And you can work with those numbers and have very ambitious policies if you do things like work on the timeline, or also Washington accounting is notoriously funny. How do you count a tax cut for working families, for example? Do you count that as lowered revenue or increased spending? And a lot of times that kind of accounting affects the top line without necessarily affecting the outcome of felt experience.
Why is there an effort to link them both and make sure that the big bill doesn't get delayed indefinitely after the small bill passes?
I completely agree with you that a lot of this discussion about process and tit for tat just is very difficult to follow and doesn't really cover the heart of this conversation, which is that we have two bills at present, one which underfunds most priorities across the board. So there are very few priorities that even get the full funding that they even need. And then there is the larger, what is known as the budget bill, reconciliation bill. That has the stuff that you're going to feel in your everyday life. Universal pre-K. We're talking about college, community colleges. We're talking about expansion of Medicare. And we're debating including vision and dental in Medicare, conversations about lowering the age of it, robust climate action, renewable energy. All of that stuff that you're going to feel in your everyday life is in what is known as the Build Back Better Act, aka the Reconciliation Bill. Now, when we were discussing the scope of this bill way earlier in the year, this is the original infrastructure bill. And we have a vast majority of Democrats, about 96%, that are in agreement of the entire agenda. Now, a very small handful of Democrats, about 4% of the party, are trying to essentially split these two priorities up. And I personally don't think it's an accident that the ones that a lot of lobbyists love are in the much smaller, underfunded bill that don't make prescription drugs easier to buy and more affordable, etc. And what they want to do is split them apart, force a vote on the first one, and because we have such narrow margins in the Senate and the House, the read that we have is that they'll just dump the second one, leave the other one out to dry, and just never actually vote on it. And so the way that we bring our two parts of the caucus together is by saying, you know what? My bill is bound up in your bill, and your bill is bound up in my bill. So do I love this very, what I would argue a conservative underfunded bill? No. But I will vote for it if we pursue them both together. But what we should not take is this approach, which is what people are trying to do by forcing a vote tomorrow on an under-considered, under-amended bill by itself, by saying, we want to force this vote right now, and it's either my way or the highway. You don't work together. I want your vote, but I will give you nothing for it. Your community will not benefit from this as much as mine will. We don't have to pursue that route. We can, instead of saying it's either mine or yours, we can say both of us can succeed together. And that is the case that the Progressive Caucus is making. But if we vote for this bill tomorrow, Rachel, and I want to be very clear about this, if we vote for this underfunded, too small infrastructure bill alone, instead of voting for it with the rest of the president's agenda, if we vote for it alone, it could make our climate crisis worse, and it risks being the only or the last substantive piece of legislation that we will pass. I do not believe, we do not have the assurances necessary to believe in good faith that reconciliation will pass if infrastructure passes tomorrow, because it gives that small, narrow margin of Democrats that have, really been making this process quite difficult. There was an overall agreement between the process 2 months ago, and then there was a reneging of that. And so if we can just stick to our original plan, stick to the promises we've made each other, we can proceed in good faith and transform the lives of millions of Americans for the better.
Do you feel optimistic?
I do feel optimistic because the Progressive Caucus, and not just the Progressive Caucus, but we are now seeing a lot more Democrats, even not part of the Progressive Caucus, join and say, you know what? Childcare, healthcare, the climate crisis, this is too important to shelve. It's too important to shelve. And I also want to really thank people at home for supporting House Democrats who do not accept corporate PAC and lobbyist money. And those sorts of Democrats are not just progressive, They're not just conservative. They really transcend a lot of party ideology, but they're a recent phenomenon and that have really been surging since 2016 and 2018. And I really do believe that that is what is changing the dynamic that we're seeing in Washington today, where that stranglehold that lobbyists have traditionally had over Washington, that's still very much do in a lot of sectors, is starting to loosen, because everyday American voters and everyday people at home are starting to support members of Congress and send members to Congress that don't just do what lobbyists tell them to do, but say, we're going to make tough decisions. This is a moment of heartburn, but I want to be clear that not voting for this tomorrow is not a permanent decision. We can always reconsider it when the time is right and when these tensions have been assuaged. And I do believe that they will be assuaged.